Paranormal believers, what made you believe? It's Em here. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. A small trigger warning for suicide in a couple of these stories. Story 1. I used to work night shifts in group homes for the mentally disabled or severely mentally ill. At one house I worked at, there was constant scratching coming from the walls. I figured it was just squirrels, but now I'm not too sure. We had set a lot of traps and I never caught anything. But this isn't what made me a believer. What happened was one night I was watching TV in the living room. After all the residents had fallen asleep, around 3 a.m., the doorbell starts ringing like someone is frantically pushing it. I got up and went to the door. But when I got there and opened it, nobody was there. Now, the 3 things you need to know about the entryway. First is that the entry is into the living room, and I can't see it from the couch. Second is that the front door is a very large window on a 2/3 plus of the door's window. And lastly, that the walkway to the front door is up to 20 to 30 feet quarter that has a 12-foot brick wall on either side. So in order to ding-dong ditch, you'd have to run back that entire length to be able to duck around a corner. I figured I was being pranked by one of our more mischievous residents, so I went and checked on them all, and they were all fast asleep. As soon as I finished shutting the last resident door, the doorbell started frantically ringing again. I rushed to the door again, only to find nobody there. This time I was determined to catch them. So I turned all the lights off except the TV and hid right beside the door, so I'd be able to immediately open it when they came back. After 20 minutes, the doorbell started going insane again. I jumped out and quickly turned on the walkway lights and looked out the window, but nobody was there. I then opened the door thinking maybe they were hiding to the side of the door like I had. After seeing nobody there, my stomach dropped and I got a feeling of dread. I slowly started closing the door. As soon as the door was closed all the way, the doorbell started going nuts again and stayed that way for at least 15 minutes before stopping again. It was almost as if whatever it was took great pleasure in mocking and taunting me. I locked the door and ran my butt to the couch after turning on all the lights I could. Another disturbing thing about this is it seemed to read my mind. Whenever I got the urge to go outside and smoke, it would start with the doorbell again. It's like it didn't want me to forget it's there and the threat. Looking back, I'm pretty sure it was a poltergeist. That place was rife with bad energy, as most group homes are. A lot of suffering and raw emotions happen at those places. It also didn't help that we had in there who had literally gone insane after watching his parents get murdered in front of him by a medium. Low-functioning schizophrenic with what I've confirmed of at least 8 distinct people talking to him in his head. Both of these residents are constantly having crap knocked off their shelves and walls in the middle of the night. And it's super common for them to be yelling at people that aren't there to shut up in the middle of the night. I used to think it was just mental illness, but now I'm not too sure. Also, years later, I worked in a facility where someone hung themselves in the bathroom. The bathroom door slams shut in the middle of the night if you try to leave it propped open, which is company policy. Wow, OP, that story was honestly a lot heavier than what I was expecting when it first started. It does sound like there's probably a whole lot of suffering in that building, so it makes sense that if there was a ghost lurking around looking for the perfect place to cop a squat, OP's job would be the place to be. Story 2. I used to work for a couple haunted hotel properties in a town where gold was found. It brought all sorts of history to this small town, and all the original buildings were still there. I never believed in them. Certain staff members refused to enter one house alone. I was cleaning the house on my own, waiting for my coworker to arrive. Upon entering one room in particular, I felt off. That was the first time I saw a shadow person. There was also one room that without fail, a guest would check out and say that the closet door opened and slammed shut forcefully. I had to bring extra pillows and blankets to that room prior to the guests showing up. They called me maybe around 8 p.m. to request it. I locked the front door and went to the property. Wouldn't you know it, the exact same thing happened to me as I was leaving the room. Other things include people seeing a woman and a child looking out from the windows. I felt dizzy in the kitchen storage area and absentmindedly told a maintenance coworker. He said, "In the kitchen?" Yeah, our previous owner's son hung himself in the basement. Ever since we sealed it off, stuff stopped happening. But you'll get dizzy, in a cheery way that made me wonder if he had actually just told me his grandma's banana bread recipe, and I was the crazy one. Oh, one room. Anytime a guest left, you'd find the alarm clock in the same spot under the bed without fail. Let's see. Oh, once we locked all the door stair rooms and prepared to leave, my coworker forgot something and walked back in. Came back, pale as a ghost. pun intended, saying all the doors were swung open and unlocked, and all the lights that had been turned off were on now. It was also common to turn off all the lights in the house. So many times we'd be pulling out of the driveway, look back, and everything was turned back on. That particular house was eventually sold to a lady and her kids. She once came in saying her kid was always talking to a doorway and would become fixated on it. I hadn't heard that one, but she understood when I tried to gently let her know her history with it. Another house had a nice little common sitting area downstairs. Still had the original flooring with scuffs from cowboy boot spurs. It was common to hear boots going up and down the stairs while no one else was around. Look, if everyone working at your job or whatever has an unspoken rule about not going somewhere alone, I'm gonna suggest you follow that rule, as it's probably there for a reason. I feel bad for the lady and family who purchased it though, especially since it sounds like they didn't know the house's history until after they moved. Story 3. My husband and I are both pretty cynical people, and we never really gave much thought to paranormal activity. When we moved into our previous apartment, a lot of weird stuff started happening. The following are the only ones I can remember, and an explanation of who the ghost was. The first thing we noticed was our trash can lid flying across the room. We figured one of our 3 cats had bumped into it while running/playing. But after looking around the house, we realized they were all sleeping. Our apartment was half of a house. The other half wasn't rented out yet, and the landlord was replacing doorknobs and locks in the room next to our apartment. He left a box of tools there overnight at around 2 a.m. My husband heard loud banging in that room. He thought someone had broken in and went to go check it out. The box of tools was completely across the room from where the landlord had left it, and everything else was completely in place. One night, my husband, Ben, and I were watching TV. And my husband and cat looked out the window roughly. My husband starts freaking out, asking me if I saw the misty figure in the window that he and the cat had just seen. I told him I hadn't. The area where we used to live had a lot of homeless people around, so my husband went looking around the perimeter of the house to see if it was a homeless person, finding a place to rest for the night or something, but he found nothing. We told our landlord about this, and he told us that one of our mutual friends' dad had committed suicide in the building we lived in. I wanted to bring it up to this friend, but I didn't want to be insensitive. One day, I casually mentioned we had some paranormal activity to my friend, and he laughed and said he was waiting for me to say something. Apparently, he had several friends live in the house that experienced activity. He also said his dad loved to play practical jokes and wasn't surprised at all that he was spooking us. One night, around 3 a.m., the ghost was making some noise in the next room. My husband went into the room and said, "Hey, Opie's friend's dad's name. It's pretty late and you're kind of freaking me out. Would you mind keeping it down?" And we have never heard from him since. Well, isn't that one hell of a resolution? I sympathize with Opie's friend, and it was nice Opie didn't want to bring it up and be a jerk. But it's kind of funny that the friend knew his dad's ghost had been doing this for probably years. It's also pretty cool how as soon as Opie's husband asked the guy to stop, he just did immediately. Story 4. Not sure I believe in ghosts, and I think most things can be explained. But here's my story anyways. Growing up in the house next door to us was someone's second home, and when they were gone, which they usually were except in the summer, we'd help take care of the house and keep an eye on it. As the owner's parents got older, they started staying there for weeks at a time, and the owner would come visit on the weekend. So we'd usually check on them every other day or so. The owner's dad settled into a routine. He'd open the garage and sit in a lawn chair all day, waving to everyone who went by. And in the evenings, he'd lay in bed and watch TV. Unfortunately, a few years ago, he passed away. A few months after that, weird things started to happen. Late at night, the TV turns on, the houses are mirrored, so their mess has a window right across from my parents' master, and they could see the light from the TV. We figured they must have gotten into town late, so in the morning, my dad tries to take their thumbnail. But no one is there, so he calls the owner, and the owner confirms no one came up last night and asks us to look inside. Sure enough, TV is on and no one is there. Second night, same thing. TV comes on, so my dad calls the owner, confirms no one should be there, and asks us to check it out. We go in, and no one is there, so we turn off the TV. Third night, the same thing happened, but this time I checked to make sure there's no alarm for the TV set to turn it on, and nothing. This continues until we just finally unplug the TV. After the first night of no TV, we go again to the house to check and make sure they aren't having electrical issues that could have been turning the TV on somehow and might start a fire. And we check the electrical panel by the garage, and we'd see the old lawn chair had been knocked off the shelf. We'd tell the owner, and all of us just jokingly say it must be his dad who's bored. So we set the chair by the driveway, and that's where it's been ever since. Story 5. I don't know if I'm a believer per se. I tend to be very skeptical about things like this, but something happened to my grandmother years ago, and it really made me question the validity of paranormal activity. In the last months of his life, my grandfather had this really old picture of his parents framed and hanging up on a wall in their house. He had become very sick and needed help doing almost everything. He was in no shape to even go to the bathroom on his own. much less rearrange the house decor. My grandmother diligently took care of him while also working a full-time job, so to say that she was exhausted regularly would be an understatement. Anyway, back to the picture hanging on the wall. My grandfather had been asking my grandmother to move it to another place in the house in the weeks before his death because he was afraid that the sun hitting it in the middle of the day would damage it. Oftentimes, he would ask when my grandmother was busy doing something else, cooking or whatever, so it often slipped her mind to do it. Anyways, time went by, he eventually passed away. And for 3 nights in a row following his death, the picture fell off the wall onto the floor, face down in the middle of the night. My grandmother was still devastated by the loss of her husband, and likely had her thoughts elsewhere and just chalked it up to coincidence. Finally, on the 3rd night of it happening, she got out of bed and said, "Okay, Jay, I'm moving your picture for you." So she did and hung it on her bedroom wall, where it would be out of the sun, and it was never an issue again. Could it really be a wild coincidence? Maybe. But it certainly made me think twice about it. This story is actually kind of sweet. I am sure losing your long-term spouse is devastating, but it was so nice of your grandmother to fulfill his last wish and move the picture out of the way, to prevent it from getting damaged. Although I do find it a little funny that to prevent it from getting hurt from sun damage, the ghost kept dropping on the floor. But that's just me. Story 6. I kind of always have, but didn't acknowledge it until this happened to me. In my childhood home, there was old electronics laying around, like those really old big TVs. And every time I was in the room alone, the electricity would tick and my parents always brushed it off because, again, they were old electronics. When I was alone at home, I swear I could hear steps. Things fell in other rooms without there being a window open, and sometimes the lights would go off without me touching the switch. This all happened throughout my entire childhood. The last day I stayed in the place, I was packing, and my parents went out to buy food, I believe. When I felt a cold breeze behind me, I turned around to see if I left the window open, and there was a figure in my doorway. It wasn't threatening or scary. Aside from being completely faceless, it was just standing there. It was about my height and very skinny, and it wasn't moving. I don't know how or why I felt great sadness, like the spirit was feeling sad that I was leaving. Something fell to my feet and I picked it up. When I turned down to my doorway again, it was gone. I believe that whatever that was attached to my old childhood place. And I don't know how or what, but I sometimes think I feel something similar to what I felt back then. But it's very rarely. Story 7. 2 years ago, my granddad died. He died suddenly of a pulmonary on his conservatory floor with my grandma to paramedics beside him. My dad is an only child, and he was pretty gutted about his dad dying. My dad went to visit a medium, mainly out of curiosity. This woman had never met or had contact with any of my family. She told Dad that Granddad was beside her, telling her information. She was able to tell my dad in very high detail how my granddad died, how he felt while he was dying, how he was feeling when he died, what happened, and what was said in the conservatory at the time, etc. And the only people who would have known this kind of information were my granddad, Grandma, and the paramedics. She was also able to tell Dad details about our family that she couldn't have found anywhere. Dad went home to tell Grandma what the medium said and why Grandma broke down. Everything was 100% accurate. 100%. With no possibility of her researching us beforehand. I know there are people who claim to be able to communicate with the dead, and I know that some of them are scammers, but I absolutely believe that some are very real. Story 8. Me and my mom were home alone and heard voices. We were in the living room at the time. She thought she left the TV on in her room at the end of the hall, but we got up to check and it was clearly not as we approached the room. And then the light whispers turned into a child's laugh, which freaked me the F out. It was just loud enough to plainly hear. As we approached, the broom closet was open, which was normal, but I asked if it was coming from the closet. As a child, you tend to think these things. As soon as I said that, I saw a shadow dart across the closet floor into the corner. We both gasped and she closed the bedroom door, picked me up and began running out of the apartment. The door didn't close all the way and it was slowly opening, and I could just barely see it over her shoulder as she carried me. And there was a silhouette of what clearly was a person or child crouched in the corner of the closet. It moved in such a way that it almost looked like an animation, which was weird. It wasn't fast or moving, but it was very weird as I remember it. We moved apartments later that year. I definitely don't blame Opie's mom for wanting to leave that apartment, and honestly, I have to give her major props for it. I feel like horror movies always have crap start to hit the fan because the family doesn't want to move, which ends up with me yelling at the screen. So at least these people had the sense to move. Story 9. I was stationed at the Pentagon a couple of years after 9/11. It was after midnight and I had to go to a new office to get some copies. I came out of one of the stairwells in what I thought was the correct corridor, but due to reconstruction, the signs had been taken down. I wandered the corridor for a few minutes trying to get my bearings. I turned a corner and there was a Marine a little ways away from me. I tried to get his attention, but he turned and started walking away. He was wearing the guide uniform for the daytime tours. They usually wear the taps on their shoes so the tourists will pay attention to them, but he didn't make any noise. I tried to walk faster. He had turned a corner, causing me to lose sight of him. I turned the corner also when there was only one floor and plywood wall with a single exposed light bulb, no doors, and no way through. I decided I had enough of being lost and went back to where I started and found the place I needed on the second try. Story 10. My wife rang me at work to tell me my dad, who had died, recently had come to her. They were in a treehouse which held significance that I nearly fell over. When she said it was weird, he looked like he had diamonds in his eyes. A couple of weeks after that, I was at a friend's house in the kitchen eating a sandwich with her 12-year-old daughter at the table. She is formed when it comes to the paranormal. She started staring behind me when I asked her if she was okay. She was looking at space for some reason. She said, "He saw you. You know, who saw you?" I said, "The man with the diamonds and his eyes stand behind you." She said she'd already getting out of her chair. She walked around the table, hugged me, and said he needs you to know how proud he is of you and how much he loves you. We had spread his ashes in the lake with my mother and father. The diamonds on the lake Pop used to call the sparkling as the rising sun hit the water surface. I miss you, old man, every day and love you, you old bastard. Story 11. I was always very skeptical until I went to work where I was now. I worked 24-hour shifts in a medical center that used to be a full-size hospital. During the night, you can hear people walking up and down the stairs, tapping on the metal caps on the edge of the steps, and furniture being moved upstairs. Babies have been heard crying, and my closest work colleague has heard a loud thump like a stack of books being dropped, and someone tapping on the window outside. Multiple people in one room will all get cold shivers and feel someone watching. But the thing that really seals the deal is that multiple people, including myself, have caught glimpses of someone walking past the reception desk and have to do a double take. And every time it's been a tall woman, some think in an old nurse's uniform. I've never felt threatened by them, and no one has ever been harmed, so I've become quite used to them now. And sometimes it feels odd when they're having a quiet night. Look, sometimes the grind never stops, even when you pass away. It does seem like some of those noises just might be explainable, but the woman? Nah, that for sure sounds like a ghost to me. Story 12. I think I've always believed that strange things have happened pretty much my whole life, but this made me believe beyond a shadow of a doubt. When I was a teenager, my dad moved into a new house. We knew the people who'd previously owned it, and they were actually the ones who built it. They told us there were some odd things happening there, but my dad brushed it off. We moved in and weird stuff began happening immediately. Things began moving around, stuff going missing, doors closing on their own, etc. But one night I was laying in bed with my brother watching a movie and he had fallen asleep. I saw what looked like the shadow of a man in the hallway crawling on hands and knees. Now my dad often did this to try and scare us, so I wasn't immediately freaked out, but then my dad opened his bedroom door directly across the hall. There was no one in the hallway. I freaked the freak out and refused to leave the room. Many more things happened after this, but this was the first time I couldn't chalk it up to something logical. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.